radio. We're just generally filled with a lot of grim news. And so I think it's quite a pleasure. It will be quite a pleasure for us to hear Jenna's message of hope. Jenna is no stranger to women in conversation. Maybe you've heard her speak here before. She's been here at least 4 times in the past, and mostly focusing on women in the Bible. Let's see here. Jenna is a professor of Old Testament studies, and she holds the Joseph S. Almanini Endowed Chair for Santa Clara University. In 2020, she received the Santa Clara University Presidential Award for her scholarship and contribution to the university. So it's kind of a daunting task for me to take a person who's such a rock star in the world of biblical history and research, but I'll try to condense it a little bit. Give me one more minute. Okay, I want you to imagine that you're one of Jenna's students. What do you think you would be learning about or studying in one of her classes? Do you think you'd have to know Greek or Latin or Hebrew or Yiddish or Amharic or German or any other non-native language for you? You might. Well, maybe I should just dispense with asking you to guess stuff. But if you were one of her students, her courses include intermediate Hebrew and advanced Hebrew, Bible study, history of the Old Testament interpretation with a Samson narrative regarding women, biblical portraits and issues in ministry, and then prophets, and then the book of Judges, literary criticism in the Old Testament, children of Sarah, Hagar, and Mary, and on and on and on. The book of Ruth also I should include there, and claiming the Psalms for the 21st century, which really intrigues me. I like that a lot. With regard to her publications, okay, just 2 really important ones. She's had so many awards and so many publications, but 2 very interesting ones are her participation in the New Jerome Biblical Commentary for the 21st Century. And maybe you are familiar with the New American Bible. I wonder how new it is anymore. Maybe she'll tell us. And another interesting book, I think, Supporting Cast of the Bible, Reading on Behalf of the Multitude. Both of those came out, well, that one came out in 2020, and the one about the Jerome Bible came out in 2022. But just one more. Gina's latest book is called Living Prayer, and that's a book of hours for renewing creation. So that it taps into all the ecological issues of the day, which are many. And you have a forthcoming book on Ruth, don't you? Yeah, okay. Well, anyway, I'll leave it at that. Just want to tell you. I'm going to move you off the stage. Okay, no, okay, this is really 10 more seconds. We're really fortunate to have Gina with us today. The last thing I'm going to say is she's been invited to teach at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome this fall. Oh, somebody got it wrong. I'll let her tell you. Okay, so why don't we give Jenna a nice warm welcome? Sorry.
Can you hear if I'm here? People in the back, can you hear? Okay, good. Good morning, everyone. And I didn't mean to correct Rosemary about the Greg, but I would not teach at the Greg if I was asked to. They're two very different places, and I shouldn't have corrected her because most people probably don't know the difference. But you would know the difference if you went there, especially this gathering of women. Okay. I'm so happy to be here. I have said to a couple people who I haven't seen in a while, and I'm so happy to see them. I'm thrilled to see you, but I'm not sure what women are doing here who are living very busy lives. And they come together on a Saturday morning, and I think it's, on the one hand, you should be complimented, but on the other hand, I think you should be counseled because but I also know that this is an incredible gathering. This is, as soon as you walk in the room, as soon as I walk in the room, let me say what I experience. It's just this immense energy and just great joy of people being together. And I'm so happy to be here. I know that this group has been meeting, I checked in with Gene Molesky, for 14 years. That's pretty amazing. And that's such a credit to Gene and the other founder of this, and to all those that have picked up the baton. You know, it's great when women know how to do things. They start something and then they hand it over to other people, and those hand it over to other people, and suddenly we have lots of people that take responsibility. So it's just great. Even the spread over there, I said to Deb, did you bring all this? She goes, no, everybody brings something. You know, the whole thing bespeaks of what women do when women gather together. And that's something what I'm going to talk about today. I've been doing a lot of work on character studies in scripture, but especially I've been paying attention a lot to what I call supporting cast characters. They don't really qualify as major characters. They don't even in literary studies qualify as minor characters. They're so sort of insignificant is what readers would typically render them. But I want to suggest that they're very significant. And I want to sort of suggest that we can learn to read the text in a new way, which actually becomes kind of a praxis of justice. I always say we can either just read or we can read as a praxis of justice, which means broadening our eyes, broadening our perspective, broadening our horizon of reading. And so that's what I'm going to do today. I have a story from the Hebrew Scriptures, Old Testament, and I also have a story from the New Testament to sort of bring some balance to this and suggest they're all over the place in both parts of Scripture. So let's just take it away here, okay? So let me just see how we're going to advance here. Nope. Not sure why my thing isn't advancing. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to read the story we're going to deal with today very quickly. I could ask you to read it, but it might feel like an eye test because it's not really big up there. So I'll go ahead and read it. So now the wife of a member, and this is just short, it's 7 verses. Now the wife of a member of the company of prophets cried to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that your servant feared the Lord, but a creditor has come to take my 2 children as slaves. Elisha said to her, what shall I do for you? Tell me what you have in your house. She answered, your servant has nothing in the house. Well, except a little jug of oil. So he said, go out, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels, and not just a few. Then go in and shut the door behind you and your children and start pouring into all those vessels. And when each is full, set it aside. So she left him and shut the door behind her and her children, and they kept bringing vessels to her, and she kept pouring. And when the vessels were full, she said to her son, bring me another vessel. But he said to her, there are no more. And then the oil stopped flowing. And she came and she told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your children can live on the rest. So it's a very simple little story. We never hear the story preached in our, our three-year cycle as a lectionary, but it's an important story, and there's many important stories like this. So let's go to homework here and see. I'm not sure why. Okay, we'll just have to keep dealing with it. All right, so first of all, the story has been talked about in Scripture. These are 3 different Bibles. It's called as a heading, Elisha and the Miraculous Jug of Oil. or Elisha helps a poor widow, or Elisha's miracle on behalf of the poor. So of course, all the headings spotlight the prophet Elisha. Okay, that's the first thing we want to note. The structure of the story is very simple, and it's beautifully structured. You have this encounter between the prophet and the widow at the beginning, verse 1 through 4, and then this encounter between the prophet and the widow at the end. I'm sort of a literary critic, so I notice those kinds of things. And within those two chiastic boundaries, we call them, you have this miracle that happens, and it's quite simple. Jugs being filled with oil, and suddenly it stops because the jugs are gone. Okay? There's a crisis, however, in this story. The crisis has to do with a woman. She's, first of all, widowed. Her husband was a member of the prophet group that follows Elisha around, kind of like mendicant wanderers, okay? And she goes to him and she's trying to call him to some responsibility. And, he says, well, what do you have in your house? And she says, nothing. And then she thinks, well, I have a little, think of it as a carafe, like for salad oil, a little bit of oil, okay? So now she's widowed. Problem in the ancient world. She's also poor because there's this debt. We don't know if the debt is from her husband that was accrued and never paid off. We don't know if it's a debt she's accrued because she's widowed, but there's a debt. She also, of course, has apparently no male relative because none is noted, and this is her crisis. That's why the creditor has come to her. Now, in the ancient world, if you had a husband that died, the brother of the husband was responsible to marry you, or the next brother was responsible, as we hear in the Tamar Judah story, or the father of the husband was responsible for your care, or one of your brothers is responsible to take you in. But oftentimes there aren't any family members left, given all the wars and etc. And so the one thing she does have is she has 2 children, and she's responsible for them. And we hear eventually that they're both male children. So she has a little opportunity to have some future, except there is this debt that has to be paid off. 2 sons who will later provide for her, perhaps. Another crisis of the story is the 2 children. We hear early on in the Hebrew, it's called Yeladim, which helps us know that they're boys, because the im is a plural masculine ending. So we've got 2, Yeled means young, 2 young boys. Elisha the prophet is a male. Yes, thanks. That's a good question. I'm sorry I didn't clarify that. Thank you. Okay. And Elisha kind of drops out for a while. Now we're going to focus on her. The children also are poor because they're part of this poor household. As children, young children, they're dependent on her. They've also incurred a loss. They've incurred a loss of their father. Okay. And what else do we know about them? Well, they're about to be deprived of their mother. If the creditor has his way, and it is a male because the creditor in Hebrew is male, okay? And they're about to be taken by a stranger who is this creditor, right? So this is a little story, and they're about to be made slaves. It's a little story. We don't get a lot of information, but we can do some derivative homework. We can find out information about what it's like to be in debt and a widow with no male adult relatives to take care of you, and they have 2 children who are now going to be taken by a creditor as slaves. This is a bit of a crisis. I want to tell you a little bit, only a little bit, about the backstory here. The backstory of this is what we call the time of the Omrids. If you know the history of Israel, and even if you don't, it doesn't matter. At one point after David and Solomon are king, the nation splits in 2. Israel in the north, 10 tribes, Judah in the south. And Judah is with a capital city, Jerusalem. The north doesn't have a capital city. So the Omrids are ruling up there, and they're going to establish a capital at Samaria. But that's going to take capital. It's going to take money. It's going to take resources. So they go about establishing some very intensive policies of taxation. They call it agricultural intensification. Now, you have to understand, people are subsistence farmers in the north. All the peasants are subsistence farmers, which means you grow enough for your family that you can exchange with others in your clan. And if you can squeeze out a little extra, you hang on to that for the 4th year when the rain doesn't come, because the climate in the Fertile Crescent is typically every 3 years you have rain, and the fourth or so or fifth year you don't have rain. And so you don't have crops. So that little bit of surplus you squeeze out every year, you put aside, and you have it when you need it, okay? But then you've got these Omrids who come along and they want your surplus because they can build Samaria as a capital. They can begin to interact in international trade with these resources. I mean, the North is very, very abundant in terms of agricultural resources. But if you're a subsistence farmer, there's only so much you have. And that little parcel of land that's from your ancestors that you identify with, okay? So they heavily tax, heavily burden the population there. They increase taxation to support government policies. They have a monopoly on resources and services by state and private elite. And they're involved in what we call economic social stratification, where fewer and fewer families possess more and more of the capital. You know what that's about, huh? Okay. It's seems to be a pattern that has a long history, huh? Okay. There's high interest loans, so you can pay off your debt, but you're going to have to get a high interest loan, which means you have to be able to pay that interest. And you can repay with a surplus extraction. Now, if you don't have enough crops or resources, wool from your sheep, or milk from your goats, or corn or wheat or oil, olive oil, then you can pay with your land. And land is, of course, in the biblical tradition of covenant in ancient Israel, the gift of Yahweh. It's the ancestral gift. It's what you hold. It's what you identify. Home place is what they identify with. Okay. So this Omrid group is they don't seem to have a sense of who the Israelites are. And debt repayment, when everything else is exhausted, you could pay with your land, you could pay with your home, you could pay with your whatever. Then you can also pay with family members, children. And I'll show you some biblical texts, or at least point those out. And, you know, when the rich get richer and the poor have less voice. And so there's very little leniency about negotiating this. We have several biblical stories that suggest that, okay? Main characters in this story apparently are Elisha, the male prophet, the widow, a mother, lost her husband, and these two children. And the two characters in the story that are really crucial, around which the crisis develops and resolves, are the creditor. And let's see what we know about him. He constitutes really the central threat. It's a male. We know creditors serve the government. He's part of the elite. A creditor was among the wealthy state and private elite landowners. And though within the law, there's a hard-heartedness, I think, about this creditor's plan to take possession of the widow's children, because there was some leeway in the law. Acquiring two slaves seems to govern his fidelities, right? There's no discussion about this. Come to take her children. And though there was a law excusing obliged individuals from debt, it's not certain if the practice we know is ever carried out. We have no instances. It's in Deuteronomy 15 and also Leviticus 25. You know, you hear these laws like take care of the orphan, the sojourner, and widow. And the prophet, you hear it a dozen times. You know why you hear it a dozen times? Because nobody's doing it. And this is the same of some of these laws. These laws are legislated because of the practices that are robbing people of their children, or robbing people of their land, or robbing people who need to pay a debt and can't pay it. That's why legislation happens. But it is indicative that that has become the practice. And we don't have a big government to actually legislate over this and to monitor that it's being carried out, that you're not taking children. So that there's a law that says you can seize family members, children in particular, for debt. We have in Exodus 21, Isaiah 50 makes mention of how deplorable it is. Amos makes mention how despicable it is. Micah makes mention, Nehemiah makes mention of it. So we know it does exist, okay? The creditor, in contrast to the widow, the creditor's loyalties are aligned with the state. And I would say his pockets are lined with the growing wealth of the state's elite, to which he belongs. And the widow really is experiencing, I would say, or anticipating experiencing incalculable maternal anguish because of the loss, not only now of her husband, probably of everything she has, but in particular of her children that could provide some future for her as boys. And the children, you know, as I say, might have provided something for her, but now they're going to provide, they're no concern to the creditor when compared, you know, their loss is no concern to the creditor too. I guess that was a good slip. When you consider his large economic gain, 2 slaves, and whether he'll keep them for himself, most unlikely he will sell them. Okay. Agents of the miracle story. Elisha the prophet hatches the plan with confidence of divine intervention. The widow exercises faith and expends initiative. And children, they assist their mother gathering jars, passing them to her, even announcing the miracle is complete. But there is another set of characters in this story. We don't see them as we read through this story, but they're mentioned. They're called Re'ah. And we read past them because we're paying attention to what the title tells us it's about, Elisha saving the poor widow. And the story doesn't feature them. But I like to look at these characters because they have their counterparts in our own world, especially we are very aware of them during COVID. Essential workers. In this story, there is a group of people that Elisha mentions once. He said, go out to your neighbors and gather jugs. To all your neighbors, he says in Hebrew, kol re'ah, all your neighbors. And then he goes on to say even further, and not a few. That's a big task. And the next thing we know, we hear that they shut the door and they start filling jugs. That's all we hear. It's this passing reference. Go out to all your neighbors, kol re'ah, and gather jugs, and not a few. And go into your house and shut the door behind you and start pouring. And then the text says, they went into their house, the widow and her children went into the house and shut the door and started pouring. We don't even hear them gather the jugs. So they're mentioned only once in the prophet's instruction. They have no speaking part. They receive no description whatsoever. And we don't even hear about or see the woman and children gathering the jugs, excuse me. That was not intended. Okay. All those gummies I'm taking. No. Sorry. I do have a sleep problem. Never mind. They appear and then disappear after they are mentioned. Jeez, I can't believe you, Gina. Okay. Yet their jugs were essential for the miracle. Let's just think about them for a minute. Who are these neighbors? I'm going to talk to you about who they are. They're those people who work with jugs and jars. The people who manage the jugs and jars in the household. Okay, they're those individuals who are in charge of the domestic sphere, the domestic engineers in the ancient world. There's the private sphere and the public sphere. The public sphere is out at the gate of the town, it's out in the farm, it's out at the market, and that's all the men. And the domestic sphere, the private sphere, where children are cared for and jugs are overseen and animals are tended at the household in the lower level, and that's the sphere of the women. And the women are always called the neighbors. Those that the woman could ask something from. The widow could only talk to other women. She could not go out to some man and say, can I have your jugs? Women just didn't interact with men especially men who were married or part of other clans. So the neighbors are women. The neighbors are the women who lend the jugs. Look at the story again here. What shall I do for you? He says. Tell me, what do you have in your house? And she answered, your servant has nothing in the house. And then it's almost like she thinks, she goes, except a jug of oil. And he said, go outside, borrow vessels, to be jugs, from all your neighbors, empty vessels, and not just a few, empty vessels. Keep that in mind a minute. Then go in and shut the door behind you and your children and start pouring into the vessels. And when each is full, set it aside. So the next verse says, so she left him and shut the door behind her, and her children kept pouring, kept bringing vessels to her, and she kept pouring. We don't even hear them gathering the vessels. The overture to the neighbors is just quickly passed by, but we know they did it because they kept pouring and pouring and pouring. They had enough vessels filled with oil to sell, pay off what evidently was a gigantic debt if it was going to take 2 children, and to live on the rest. The neighbors. So easy to not see them. They don't have names. They don't have a description. We don't even know what kind of vessels they gave, what they had to do. They had to provide empty vessels. And by the way, and I'll show you some pictures. In the ancient world, people had vessels in their home. The homes were what we call 4-room houses. We know this from archaeology, and we have many vessels from the archaeological digs of the homes. The 2 top floors were the domestic sphere. The 2 lower levels were for the animals, and also where there was a table where you could have guests sitting inside and outside. One room was, to sort of clean out the manure every day for the gardens, and the other was where big vessels, about some have been found that are as much as 3 feet high. There's probably water or grain was kept there, and then some lesser vessels. Some were down there, some were up above for oil, olive oil, tons of olive oil. Think about that. Okay. Go out to all your neighbors and borrow jugs, empty vessels, and not a few. The neighbors, the prophet tells you to go to all, Cole, her neighbors, and not a few. Before kings and monarchy, Israel lived in local, cooperative, communal groups governed by being neighbors, Re'ah. And each took care of each other. And when those people, those 10 tribes I talked about a few moments ago, emancipated, seceded from the nation state, they wanted to go back to a non-king governed society. They wanted to go back to their voluntary communism, if you would call it. It wasn't possible. Jeroboam became king, and then other people fought each other, killed each other, got on the throne, killed it. It was the North was terrible. The South was a Davidic line. We knew who was going to be king each time. The North, it was a mess. It was a real series of murder and intrigue. But in the neighborhoods, people were finding ways to still act clan-like. This sort of voluntary care, interactive interdependence of one another. And each did try to take care of each other. Deuteronomy 7:7, the great commandment, love the Lord God with your whole heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your Re'ah. Love your neighbor as yourself. Members of community were neighbors. And in the prophets, which I've spent most of my life studying, the prophets, ill treatment of the Re'ah, ill treatment of the neighbor. And here we're really talking about the women. Ill treatment of the women, especially, was the beginning of the community or the nation's disintegration. Think about that, not only in terms of ancient Israel. There's real purpose for gatherings like this. There's real purpose for what women are doing on behalf of themselves these days. Beginning of the disintegration of the community, the neighbor community is the beginning of the disintegration of a nation. Neighbor women, all your neighbors. Now, we don't have anything describing here, but there are some things implicit here that we do know about these neighbors if we take the time to think about what does happen in the story. First of all, the neighbors have to make a decision. These women, when they're approached, have to say yes or no. And probably lending your jug to somebody, nothing to gain if you do, and nothing to gain if you don't. Personally, we're talking about a capital-driven society. Nothing to gain if you do, and nothing to gain if you don't. Okay. They had to be empty vessels. So perhaps they had some oil in it. They had to find some other jug. And, they didn't have 14 mixing bowls in their cupboard and 27 glasses and things like I have. They probably had one jug for oil and one jug for, the wheat or barley, and one jug for the water, and etc. Maybe they had to hand over the jug with a little oil in it already. The neighbors are to provide for that from which they are excluded. It says, once you get the jars, shut the door behind you and start pouring. The neighbors don't know what this is for. We have no reason to believe she stood and told the whole thing that I'm in debt and they're going to take my children, blah, blah, blah. She's trying to get this thing done because the creditor is coming for her children. There's yet some clear certainty in the instruction Alicia gives her that the neighbor women would provide. That gives me chills when I think about it. That they said yes, never narrated. And how many jars did they provide? We don't know. But we sort of know, don't we? Because why? Why do we know? They must have been a lot of them because they kept pouring and pouring, and they had enough to sell, pay off this big fat debt that was going to cost her 2 children, so we know it was a big debt, and enough, the prophet said, live on the rest. And not a few. So even though the story doesn't take the time to tell us about these very important agents of the miracle, we can read the story and we can discern what's implied is they had lots of jugs. So we don't know who the neighbors are. They don't get to see the miracle. They don't even know about the miracle, perhaps. I'm sorry. And yet they gave, evidently, what they had. They gave what she needed. Yes. I just love Amy. I've never thought of that, and that's what working on scripture in a group does. Thank you. Would you repeat that really loud? That was so well done. She's so, yeah. Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Do you hear that? They maybe ended up surrendering their jugs as well as their, the empty jug. They may have gotten some back. Some people may have brought their vessels, but we don't know that. So I think that's an absolutely fine specter to raise. That's just terrific. Thank you. The one with a crack in it. I know which one I would have given. So the neighbor, thank you both very much. So the neighbor's unnarrated generosity was the means to social change that took place in the life of this widow and her 2 children. The neighbors were willing to give. So let's just talk about these neighbor women. The neighbors provided resources for which he had none. And these empty vessels became vessels of hope. When she was faced with hallmarks of despair and loss. We don't know what it cost them. We don't know if they had to go without, either for a few days or indefinitely. We don't know if they had to go out and buy another jug, thanks to Amy. We don't know who they were. Bell Hooks, whose work on education I read and reread, wonderful African-American educational theorist who's no longer with us. Bell Hooks talks about the community of neighbors as the keepers of hope. Keepers of hope. That's what we do for one another. Hope becomes a means of empowerment for those for whom all else seems hopeless. We are a means of empowerment. They were means of empowerment for all those who seem hopeless. So we have two opposing poles in this story. The creditor represents the increasing buildup of stratified society. The creditor gives no evidence of human concern that would be moved by a crisis of a poor widow. The creditor creates the crisis needing resolution. We saw there was an opportunity in the law to forego collecting on this debt. And the creditor charts a course of action grounded in, I'd say, self-interest. The neighbor women narrate an alternative society of egalitarian kinship, a group of care. They represent a social configuration that is communal, operating out of, I would say, an ethic of care. Ethic of care. Like all the food back there sort of miraculously appeared this morning. An ethic of care, really. They provide a tangible means for the resolution of the widow's crisis based on self-giving, grounded in a communal ethic. The women neighbors, the Ra'ah. And so I ask a question. Who are the tyrants of our own world that would wield legalities, collecting on debts, and further disable the already disenfranchised in our society? And at the same time, I would ask, who are the anonymous change makers? The anonymous change makers whose collective small acts lift up as worthy the least among us. That'll be one of your questions when you go into discussion. And now I want to turn to the New Testament, okay? Yes, it's 2 Kings 4. There's 3 stories on chapter 4. The other 2 are very long, but this one's the first one, and it's only 7 verses. What? Are you losing people online? Okay, somehow my other PowerPoint, did somebody, my other PowerPoint's not here. Okay, I'll get it. Uh-huh.
So anyone who parked in the middle of the parking lot.
What color is the car? Do you know? It's a Prius. What color? A gray Prius in the middle of the parking lot. Okay. Okay, and also I lost my, I'll find my PowerPoint. Sorry. It was going back and forth before. I'm sorry. Okay. No, I'm so sorry. Can they hear? Okay, all right. Okay. Okay, so we're going to go to a New Testament story. What time do I have till? Okay, that's perfect. Okay, yeah, perfect. Okay, so we want to talk about some anonymous women in Jesus's world, they're not so anonymous in his world because the New Testament is smaller and we've read these stories, I guess, more closely too. And even though the Old Testament's much more important, no, I mean, the New Testament is important, but it's kind of like, the PS on the real Bible, the Old Testament is what I My colleagues are not appreciating me when I say that publicly. Okay, so here we go. Let's see if I can. For some reason, it's not moving forward. There we go. So there actually are 4 gospel stories of anonymous women who washed Jesus's feet. We can't do all 4 stories, so I picked one. And actually, 2 of them, depending on your translation, instead are anointing his head. And there is a lot of discussion. Are these all the same woman? And they're not. And are these all the same stories? They're not. And one basic reason is, as you'll see, foot washing was a very common thing to do. And they're all situated in different settings. Okay. So I just start with the assumption they're not the same. So I'm going to read this. This is even harder and tinier. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to eat with him when he went into the Pharisee's house. This is Simon Peter. And he reclined to dine. And a woman from the city who was a sinner, having learned that he was eating in Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster jar of ointment, and she stood behind him at his feet, weeping, and began to bathe his feet with her tears and dry them with her hair, kissing his feet, anointing them with the oil, the ointment. Now, when the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw it, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what kind of woman this is who's touching him, that she is a sinner. And Jesus spoke up and said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. Teacher, he replied, speak. Well, a certain moneylender had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. And when they could not pay, he canceled the debts for both of them. Talking about debts here today again, huh? He canceled the debts for both of them. Now, which of them will love him more? And Simon answered, I suppose the one for whom he canceled the greater debt. And Jesus said to him, you have judged rightly. Then turning to the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has bathed my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but she has anointed, from the time I came in, but she has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, hence she has been shown, because she's been shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven loves little. And then he said to her, your sins are forgiven. But those who were at table with him began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. So all of these stories have differences. I'm not going to talk about all 4. We don't have time, but I want to get into some depth here because these anonymous women have a very important impact on Jesus. Foot washing. Let me just talk about foot washing. Foot washing occurs in the Old Testament frequently. Abraham, when he greets the visitors at Mamre, the first thing he does is offer them water for their feet. Okay, and if you've ever been in Israel or outside of the cities, it's a very dusty place, even today. In the ancient world, even more so. We have, for example, generally foot washing was observed for 3 reasons. In domestic settings, for hygiene and comfort. When you came home, there was water, if there was water available, to wash your feet. In domestic settings, it was always devoted to hospitality. And in some cultic settings, and even today, the Muslims practice foot washing and hand washing before they go into the mosque. Up at Harem Sharif or Temple Mount, before they go into Al-Aqsa, there's these all kinds of spring outside with faucets, and people go and wash their feet and then wash their hands. Now, the practice of foot washing was originally an act of hospitality. I don't know any group that's more hospitable than Palestinians today. And I think that's something that when we go back to the biblical tradition, we find so many instances of hospitality. I remember many, many years ago when I was in the Sinai Peninsula and it was in a Jeep with some other people. I was studying at Hebrew University and we were going out on a weekend to find Mount Sinai, which, you know, you can't find. But we were going to go up on a mountain that supposedly is Mount Sinai before sunrise and watch the sunrise. But we were going at night to get there and we got lost. And we saw a Palestinian Bedouin group with all their tents flapping in the wind in the desert. So we pulled in there to get directions. And immediately they wouldn't give us directions until we came, stayed around the fire and had this, you know, little plate of lentils and some coffee. But as I was sitting there, I'm looking over at the big tent where the flaps are blowing up and down, and I kept seeing this light flashing. I couldn't figure out what it was. It looked like a screen or a TV. So I got up and, you know, thanked people, and I just, curiosity, walked over there. And when I looked in and kind of got in there, somebody invited me in. They were watching reruns of Dallas. I know. This is out in the Sinai Peninsula among Palestinian Bedouins. Yeah. But they were so hospitable to us and they gave us food to take with us. And I can't tell you the number of times. I've taken my students many times and Mustafa Abaswe or Mohammed Kasimi always invite us to their home, little home that they have. And I'm bringing, you know, 12, 14 students and they put us out in the backyard and they make a big pot of muklaba. It's this huge tank and they put chicken in the bottom and rice and all kinds of vegetables and they cook it over the fire and then they sit us around this fireplace and they have a big metal sheet there and the sons take it and turn it upside down in this tower of vegetables and rice with chicken at the top and everybody gets a spoon and you sit around there and you eat muklaba. But it's always hospitality. It's just, and it's what they're known for. And so when I read these biblical stories, I think, yeah, that's from forever. We even hear St. Paul talk about the custom in 1 Timothy 5:10, that when somebody becomes a widow, they can stay a part of the community, but they're going to be the servants of the community. They're going to wash people's feet. They're going to cook, etc. Okay. All right. And they're not talking about men widows, by the way. Okay. The hands and the feet would be washed regularly because, you know, they have the highest exposure to contaminants. And even the forehead could be rubbed, or even the whole head could be rubbed with oil. Somebody's out in the sun all day. It's just extremely relaxing. It's a gift to guests to come in and you hug them. They sit down and you're massaging their head or putting oil on their head and, you know, kind of helping that scorched skin be treated and relaxed and washing their feet. Just think about it. It's just such wonderful hospitality. And typically, such washings when one entered the house, especially an outsider or an expected guest, were signs of welcome, signs of hospitality, and such gestures were so common that we even hear Jesus reference to it indirectly. He's instructing his disciples about, you know, when they're out on mission. He says, if anyone does not welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet. If you're not welcome, that means you didn't get your foot washing. So just leave that house and shake the dust off your feet. Don't worry that your feet are still dirty. Just shake the dust off your feet. Who did the foot washing? It was usually servants or the wife of the head of the household, the head of the household. If he was married, the wife did it. So wives were kind of like servants too. And occasionally, if men were gathering, nobody did it unless somebody came in and did it. And that's what we have in this story. I said to you, the 4-room house, the lower level sometimes had a big kind of stone table. And when you had guests, they didn't come upstairs. They were downstairs in the second room, not the animal room. And it was open to the outside because the animals came through there. And people would recline around this lower table, or sometimes they could sit on some stones or a bench. And if it was gathering men, nobody washed feet. But sometimes women would come along and wash feet. Sometimes maybe they expected some change or something, but they'd wash people's feet. So there's a commonness about this story. Now let's get some matters straight regarding all 4 of these women who washed Jesus's feet. And what we have to get straight is we always hear about their long unbound hair and how they're using it to wipe Jesus' head or to wipe Jesus' feet. And I think because in Western culture, we think of women with, and probably movies and art has kind of helped create this misimpression. We think of women with long unbound hair wiping somebody's feet or their head. We think of something very erotic. And unfortunately, in translations and in interpretations, often these women are not referred to as women or even sinners, but they're referred to as prostitutes. Or interpretations give the connotation that their sinfulness was sexual sinfulness, of course. As a matter of fact, in Greco-Roman culture, long unbound hair on a woman was a sign of grief because of a loss, could be a sign of supplication, or could even be gratitude for release from oppression. And oppression could be sin. That she's out in the street by herself and comes in and does this. She's probably unattached. And Simon Peter, immediately the Pharisee says, oh, she's a sinner. Doesn't he know she's a sinner? We don't know she's a sinner. And Jesus says, your sins are forgiven, pleasing his host. But he really says to her at the end, go in peace. Your faith has saved you. There's a lot going on in this story. What's going on in this account of Jesus at Simon Peter, the Pharisee's house? Simon has failed to do what is normal hospitality, because men don't do this stuff. He offered Jesus no cleansing of feet or hands or head. And even Jesus makes that clear. He has not been offered the normal protocol, the welcome, cleaning up his feet, at least. And Simon instead tries to cover his failure. How do I know this? I think I identified with it a little bit. When you forget to do something when guests come, or you forget to do something that you're required to do or should do, instead of dealing with it, I certainly admit sometimes trying to distract attention or figure out a way to let people not be focused on the fact that I forgot to do this. So Simon Peter tries to cover his tracks, cover his failure to do what is normally expected, and makes it about the oddness or even the unacceptability of this woman he calls a sinner, who has stepped in to do what was his responsibility. Sure. What color is it? Color? Okay. Anybody? Maybe it's not ours. Okay, good. We know better. This is a gathering of women. We know better. Okay, and then as if to shift the focus, Simon Peter even goes so far to identify her as a sinner. Thankfully, in this account, this translation, not a prostitute, and now makes it a problem also about Jesus. So he does two things to sort of shift the focus. He makes her into a sinner, and then he makes it a problem about Jesus. Doesn't he know that she might be a sinner? No. Almost done. So characteristic of Jesus, Jesus does what he always does. He doesn't get into the fray. He resists getting into some argumentative discussion. He tells a parable. You know why? Because parables have a wonderful way of invading our consciousness and our conscience and cause us to decide who's really guilty. You know? So Jesus doesn't get into the fray of this. He doesn't say, how do you know she's a sinner? And by the way, you didn't give me water, wash my feet. He doesn't get into that at all. He does eventually, though, get into it. He does say it. Two people with debts, one with a debt of 50 and one with a much bigger debt of 500 denarii, and then neither could pay. And Jesus says the money changer canceled the debts of both. And then he starts talking about the money changer loving more. And of course, Simon Peter says, of course, the one who owed more. You know, he knows I can handle these things. I'm very smart. Okay. And what happens next? Now we are often assume that Jesus is suggesting that if the woman is a sinner, a really grievous sinner, she is loved more, perhaps, or she loves more. But there's a bit of ambiguity here. Who's really the more grievous sinner? I think we can have to consider that both she and Simon are sinners, as well as everybody. And both have such debts to be forgiven by how they treat others. And even concerning matters of simple hospitality. Finally, I want to just say something. As I look across the Gospels, and I'm sure you've known this too, and I know I've spoken about this here, the disciples often don't get it, do they? No. I mean, it's true. I'm not sure I would have gotten it either, but they don't get it. When they think of Jesus, they finally get he's Lord and Master. James and John come and say, can I sit at your right hand and at your left hand when you go into your kingdom? He says, you have no idea what you're asking. Okay. And then he tells the really rich parable of the sower, and they're asking ridiculous questions, and he has to explain it. Okay. And then at some point, Peter professes as Jesus talks about, he's going to be, he's going to suffer. He's going to be the suffering servant. And Peter says, I'm going to be by you. I'm standing by you. Stand by your man. And Jesus, actually, you're going to deny me 3 times. And when they're up on the mountain for transfiguration, Peter wants to put up tents and stay. And Jesus says, you don't understand. Listen to the next parable. If you want to save your life, you got to lose it. So there's just so many instances where you almost sense Jesus' frustration that they haven't got the alternative world that Jesus is suggesting for them. It's a world of diakonia. And so we note the discomfort of those at the table. Jesus does not stop the woman, which should make Simon and those in attendance more comfortable, given the omission of the host's part. Jesus, however, does not try to dilute her emotion, her tears, or make those at table more comfortable. Instead, he seems quite at ease with what she's doing, washing his dusty feet with her tears and drying them with her unbound hair, and grateful for what she's doing that Simon Peter failed to do. And as if the situation wasn't uncomfortable enough, he sides with the woman, as he does in all 4 stories, who's down on her knees performing this gesture. Jesus is a guest in this house, and he acknowledges that she is doing what the assembly of men have failed to do, offer simple hospitality. And at the end, he turns toward the woman and he speaks to Simon, and he says, you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has bathed my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she never stopped kissing my feet. You did not anoint my head, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Think about these 4 stories of women washing Jesus' feet. And Jesus got a lot from his mother. I know I talked about this one time when I talked about the Magnificat. Mary talks about princes being pulled down from their thrones, and the lowly being exalted, and the hungry being filled with good things, and the rich being sent empty away. And then she's the mother of Jesus. And it sounds just like the gospel to me. I think Jesus got a lot from those that were ministering to him and with him. And I'm sure of it in this instance, because these 4 biblical accounts of these women, in each instance, there's an objection that Jesus stands against. And in each instance, Jesus sides with the woman, offering the simple act of cleaning his feet and anointing his head. But we should not be surprised, because what he was trying to teach his disciples that they often didn't get, because they are men in a very patriarchal society, he's trying to teach them diakonia. And diakonia means simply serve. Serve one another, great and small. Be a servant, as Jesus was the suffering servant. And so I end with, I think Jesus was very, very influenced by these women. Because right before he's handed over to death, he knows that the Father has given all things into his hands, and that he has come from God and he's going back to God. So he gets up from supper, takes off his outer robe, puts a towel around his waist, and he pours water into basins and kneels down and begins to wash their feet, the disciples' feet, and wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He comes to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, you're not going to wash my feet. You know what he's thinking. That's the role of servants. And Jesus answered, you don't know what I'm doing, but you will understand. And Peter said to him, you'll never wash my feet. And Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no share with me. Unless I can do this to you so you get it, you have no share with me. And Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet, but my hands and my head. And Jesus said, one who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And after he washed their feet, he put back his robe on and he reclined with them. And he said to them, do you know what I've done? Do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right. That is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. So I've set for you an example that you also should do as I've done to you. What's the role of these 4 anonymous women in Jesus' life? Jesus experienced sort of care and comfort, attention and relaxation of what servants could give him, or households where servants didn't give it to him. And Jesus uses that familiar, well-known ritual that had been manifested to him over and over again by women to try in this last-ditch effort to show the disciples what they would have to do to be members of Jesus's community, especially after his death. These anonymous people in our scriptures have great contributions. When I started working on, and I'll stop in a minute, Jean. When I started working on anonymous, very supporting cast characters, I call them because they don't qualify even as minor characters, I went over to Cal Berkeley to the Lit department because I needed some literature to study. Does anybody study about these? And this one woman gave me an article on a sociology of reading. And she said, how we read text influences how we read our world. Who we see in text and who we read past influences who we see in our world and who we read past. So if we cultivate the vision to see everybody that's there, even those that are implied there, and try to hear their story or do homework to find out their story, that's a new level of reading of our text. And as I said in the beginning, we can just read, or we can develop a praxis of justice in how we read. And only then will our vision, not just of these texts, but of our world, be broadened. And I think women do that already. I will admit, COVID certainly made me attentive to all the essential workers who daily risk their lives, and some who lost their lives, so the rest of us could take refuge in our homes or our places of work, to Zoom in to work or whatever, and still have paychecks, etc. Those are the same people. There is a gospel text at the end of this. It says, truly, I tell you, wherever in all the world this gospel is preached, what she, this woman, has done will be recalled in memory of her. And indeed, we don't know her name, but I would say the fact that Jesus then decides in his last-ditch effort to teach these disciples what they've got to do, participate in this new reality. They have to like the women that ministered to him, that he was so moved by, that he paid attention to, that he decided to duplicate their actions. In that sense, there is the memory of her. Thank you. Sorry, who's in charge now? Who's in charge? Yes. And women. So what we want to do is, it's okay. Yeah.
Just give me 2 minutes. I'll get those people back.
All right. So tell me when. We're going to just get people who are on Zoom off their Zoom. And then if everybody wants to take a seat, we only have about 10 minutes or so that I was just told. Is that okay now? All right. So I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing during this time. I think I'm supposed to be, Jean, where are you? Am I supposed to ask about the answers to the questions or ask if they have questions or? Oh. Also, I mean, I was in a small group. It was just wonderful. So maybe we could even just do this. Or if you have a question, you can ask a question too. But who are the anonymous change makers whose small collective acts lift others up, some of the least among us, or just whose collective acts, just simple acts that we get caught up in, we get our attention. Just name what the act is. Somebody in our group start. What's one thing you said? What's one act you caught your attention? Yeah. Oh, that's right. We'll do it. Okay, so anonymous gentleman who does all kinds of landscaping that the whole neighborhood gets to benefit from. Or somebody else said, somebody puts out these book borrowing boxes at the end of their driveway and suddenly everybody's putting those out. You know, it's kindness is infectious. Good deeds are infectious, you know? Any other examples that you came up with in your group? So you can just say quick. Yeah. Yeah. How can you not think about, you know, man, how can you not think about what you're suggesting? A plate of food with all the vegetables and fruit that, you know, somebody picked, somebody planted, and somebody's living in less than, you know, our opulent or well-established settings. The sense of, you know, gratitude that needs to kind of come up in us. What else? Things, yes. Poll workers. Oh, that's a good one. And poll workers aren't always treated so well, and yet we depend on them for their honesty and what they can do for us in maintaining our governance. What else? Yes. Oh, that's fantastic. The lifeguard who kept treading water day after day until she would finally get off that diving board. That's terrific. What else? Yes. Right. And she's worked in the system. Amy's worked in Oakland and in the system, building a community of care where people who are homeless feel like they belong, feel like they have worth. I don't know if you want to say something more about that, Amy. But just a sense of creating, you know, a space, a community space for people that gives them worth and value and recognition. What else? Working with homeless people, of course. Yeah. You know, empowering people that, according to the mores of our society, Amanda works with, don't have power. And suddenly they're given identity and worth because of what you go to every day. Yeah. What else? Anybody? Okay. And then also we ask, in your own lives, can you just mention, was there anybody in your own lives that inspired you, that you were just shocked by, who did something for you you didn't expect and really, you know, lifted you up and inspired maybe you to do likewise? Anybody? Letter carriers, mail carriers, somebody on Zoom offered that. That's great. What else? Yes. Yes, Jean Molesky Paws is so amazing, inviting people and myself included to her house. The only problem is I never say I'm going to try to do likewise because I could never cook like her. But I do try to bring people to my house and at least do hospitality like her. She's a great model. What else? Yes. Oh.
And then welcome me into her family, her kids. And then she helped my parents because she knew we loved food as a child and invited us to Chinese dinner. And my folks, we read with them, and now my dad is going to heaven. He said to me, I'll never worry about you because your kids love you. You know who's supposed to go to the benefit?
Okay. That's an incredible story of just someone who enters your life, Marie Harris in this instance, who decided to become part of your family and give care as much as you cared for her. That's terrific. It doesn't have to be something spectacular. Yes. Mhm. I know you though, and I see you across the way. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and you help make our community by coming in. We have a lot of people from the neighborhood who come in or from outside, and we don't want to be this insular community of prayer that sort of is in contradiction. So your being there is very important to us. And people do know who you are, by the way. Yes. And Mr. Rogers says, when things get really bad, look for the helpers. Yes, please. Notes. That's wow, what a story. Her husband was in hospice during COVID for a couple months. A little table outside the room. Nobody could go in, but people would leave food and notes and just indications that you were and he was in their hearts and minds and prayers. That's really powerful. You had your hand up, please, Susan. Wow. And anonymous or not? Mhm. Yeah, very powerful. Think about, I mean, I've heard some other people say, the women that come into the neonatal intensive nurseries and, hold babies so that, these babies have human contact. Nobody knows who they are. The nurses come and go. They get to sign in, they get to sign out, but they make hats and blankets for these babies. Nobody knows who they are, but they're home doing these things. Yeah. I just got the sign. She said, what do we do for the last 20 minutes now? Or here. Okay, I know you do.
So what do you say to our neighbor, Jenna? To me, an example of a woman who knows the work that has been given to her to do. And each of us have been given a work to do, and we support each other. But Jenna, thank you for enlivening us and turning around the way we look at Scripture and the way we will live our lives. And I think all of us, when we see Pope Francis wash the women's feet at the prison at Holy Thursday, we will remember this moment. Yeah. So I am here with a couple of announcements and looking toward the future. I want to tell you that after our last session with Beth, a reading group on discernment using her book has gone on, and it has been a phenomenal experience. 9 of us meet every Tuesday night on Zoom and do the process of discerning a decision in our life. And to be able to do that with other women and do it with the guidance of Beth's book has been really, really wonderful. So, keep alert for opportunities where we can develop in creative ways, other ways we can be together as women in conversation. I think as Brenda had suggested at one point. So that's the one thing. Second, Cara, who is a member and has been for many years at Newman, is in hospice. She's been dedicated to Catholic worker and to the homeless in Berkeley for many, many years. One of her wishes is that if we could each contribute $25, either buy a Safeway gift card, or Susan Schaefer here is willing to accept $25 or a check for the homeless in Berkeley. And I believe they'll be distributed at Easter for the homeless. And if you don't have money today, you can drop it off at the front desk. So I think, isn't that a beautiful offering? Really beautiful, continuing to remember people, as you're struggling with your own passing into the next world. Connie also mentioned about the landlines, and I think she sent an email to everyone, so please be proactive on that. And as far as thinking of our neighbors, not only Cara's suggestion, but Barbara, who had to leave early to go to Santa Rosa, I believe sent all of us the dire situation in Haiti. And if you feel you can be an anonymous donor to the project in Haiti for the school that she's supporting, and there are other projects in Haiti too, but this might be our Lenten time to do something anonymously as a good neighbor, bringing our jar so someone else can fill their jars. And I want to also say that I feel like women in conversation, or not I, but the leadership team, and there are 7 of us that are very active on the leadership team, feel it's time to do a discernment. We've been around for 14 years, and we've developed in many different ways, but we would like to do a discernment perhaps sometime in May, and take a couple hours discerning the future. I'm not asking for a show of hands right now, but I just want to say, think about it, pray about it, and we will send out an announcement at some point, and we'd like to have as many who would like to join so we can think about how we'd like to move forward in the future. And speaking of the future, there are, I think this is really clever. Ellen had this idea earlier, and these are little bookmarks, and they mentioned the speakers. We've already had 2, and then we have our next one in May. It's our 3rd week in May, and it's going to be, again, Mary Jo McConaughey. And Mary Jo was here last year on Playing God. She's going to speak with us next time on her understanding of the Cold War and its effect on spirituality, faith, and religion in Latin America, particularly Guatemala. And I'm working with her. We're in a writing group, so I know what she's writing, but really phenomenal. And she's focusing on women, and women whose stories are often not heard in terms of liberation theology. And I think it's a great seed for way we may be able to go forward in the church, looking again at comunidades de base, right? Base communities, which is what we are. So I highly recommend. It'll be the third Saturday of May. Susan? Deborah? No, there's one more announcement. Maria, where are you, Maria? Yes, Maria has a very personal announcement. Can you come forward? I mean, the people in Minnesota probably can't pick you up on your offer, but.
Not a public speaker. I have a mattress for a hospital bed that people can rent. Oh, sorry. Hospital beds that people can rent for their houses. They need mattresses, and I have a mattress. I was wondering if anybody wants it. I'll be happy to deliver. I don't want to throw it away. So if you know somebody who wants it, you know somebody who can use it, let me know.
In the back of the room, there are sheets of table. Please include your name and emails. And in the chat, please include them on the chat for new members, if you'd like to be on the mailing list, and you will receive announcements, and we chat with each other about causes that we think are important or speakers we think are important to pay attention to. Let's see, Deborah, you're on.
This also doesn't affect the people in Minnesota. First of all, my every month reminder, if you brought food or treats, please take them home. They won't get eaten here. So please do take them home or give them to somebody else to take home. They'll go in the refrigerator and they'll get thrown away. If you are sitting on or near a brown chair and you are able, not now, when we're over, if you're sitting on a brown chair, please just take it into the next room and stack them against the windows, if you can manage that. The other thing is, if you're using a cup that you got from our table, please just put it on the cart where the cream and stuff is, and we'll make sure those cups get washed. Please don't leave them on the floor. So that's it.
Is there anyone else who would like to make an announcement to our group? Concha? Yes.
So, we all love a good movie, right? Okay, and you know that when you enjoy that beautiful screen with whatever the program is, that there's a whole host of people behind the production that bring it to life. And so, such as our Women in Conversation team that works behind the scenes here to bring this production to us here. And we've all enjoyed and been edified by this amazing speakers and our conversation. I certainly learn a great deal all the time. And what we'd like to do is invite everyone to contribute. And thank you to those of you who have already, and that's noted. But just FYI, one person has stepped forth and anonymously said that they could not this year contribute. Totally appreciate that, because I have a string of anonymous donors, anonymous women here who would like to step up and cover that for that person. And so I would like to have you please pay attention to the Google Mail that you're barraged with when I send them out, because there's information there about how to write the checks and where to submit and how to donate through Newman, or give them directly to me, as I have some today. Thank you.
Before we have our closing prayer, I was just thinking, I can't believe we're a little bit early. Sorry, Jenna. Maybe could have given you 5 more minutes. Why don't we just take a moment to reflect, to go into the wells of our lives, the well of this life that we share as women in conversation, where women do gather around wells to talk. And last Sunday, we heard Jesus talking to a woman at the well. And the well is a place of invitation, a place of encounter, a place of meeting. And recognize that each of us, the woman sitting next to you, you are a well, you are a jug, you are a jar, sometimes full, sometimes empty, but always with neighbors around you, and how each of us can be a good neighbor, and that we recognize the strength of community. Give thanks for the words that have been planted within us today. May they blossom and bear fruit. And in deep appreciation for each woman in this group sitting here. And may we all have safe journeys. I can ask Jane Claire if she'd come up now. Jane Claire and I have known each other since we were 18. You do the math. You're going to end with a closing prayer. Yeah, we kind of began on a spiritual journey together, didn't we?
Yeah, down in the basement of the convent.
Chris is the only one who had a cigarette, right? She had it in her sewing box.
Their sewing box. I was jealous because Jean had much better nun shoes than I did. And as I was listening to you, Jean, I thought that was such a beautiful prayer. So I'm just going to say another prayer that is a blessing. It comes from a book of blessings by Sister Maxine Schonk. So it's asking for the blessing from God, the God of wisdom. May we be blessed with the wisdom of God, who fills our hearts with vision so that we may see all things with the eyes of God. May we have the wisdom and knowledge to discern God's desire. May we be drawn to a deeper awareness of God's activity in our lives. May we give voice to that wisdom as we enter into communion with all of God's people and all of God's creation. May the God of wisdom bless us now and always.
Thank you. Go forth, wash the feet.